What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Final Fantasy Tactics: The Ivalice Chronicles, an updated version of an old fan favorite for the TRPG genre, right up there with the likes of Tactics Ogre. And with this version bringing both a more or less faithful version of the original alongside an enhanced version which features updated graphics, a bunch of quality of life features, and some other changes, there's a fair bit to talk about here. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video going over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked down below as well. But in the case of this particular title, a few things to mention. If you're aware of the date, you may well realize that this game does not officially release for a couple of more days, and that is because I received a review key from Square Enix to cover this ahead of time. The embargo for those reviews actually ended a couple of days ago, so even though I'm early, I am technically a little late at the same time, as there was a fair bit of game to get through here. But at any rate, the game itself should be releasing in full in 2 days, September 30th. Now, as far as 100% goes, the nice thing about doing that for these older games is everything is pretty well laid out and apparent before you jump in, so it's pretty easy to look things up if you're wondering where to go or what to do, that kind of thing. And that's especially helpful for a couple of cases, like recruiting some of the secret characters, such as Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, where to learn a couple of hidden skills so you can master every job, and finding out the best enemies to poach for a particular achievement. But as with many a JRPG, there is also an in-game achievement tracker via the in-game Chronicle, which will let you see this stuff and kind of pace out what you want to do, but it is possible to do everything in one run as long as you are paying attention and don't miss some of the stuff that is missable, like the secret summon or an ability for our main character that you only have a couple of opportunities to learn if you don't want it to be a headache anyway. But with all of that stuff out of the way, let's talk about this particular title. So, as you would probably expect with the nature of this release, there's been a significant amount of changes to the original game via both the enhanced version, yes, but there is actually also a regular version of the old game in here that is minimal changes. The only thing they really touched there was doing stuff like adding an autosave, as well as using the updated English translation from the War of the Lions release for, I believe it was PSP back in like the 2000s. But for the most part, the classic version is trying to be a faithful version of the original game. Then there's the enhanced version, the sort of main draw here, and that's where the bulk of the changes can actually be found. For starters, updated graphics, that kind of thing. This is always a bit of a mixed thing with people. Some people appreciate it, some people don't. The thing about pixel graphics being that I think sometimes the updates to it can be a little hit or miss in terms of like actual visual appeal. But to go alongside those graphical updates, it also hosts a revamped UI, revamped controllers, proper keyboard support even. Notably, it is also fully voiced. They voice acted the entirety of the original game here, or at least that is to say, again, the War of the Lions translation that they're using. And then, on top of all that, even more quality of life changes, like the ability to just straight up speed up the game, the autosaves that I've already mentioned, stuff like that. So even if you've played the original, there are a substantial amount of changes and improvements here to adjust flow and stuff, and if you don't like any of those, the classic version is also available in the same purchase. But what a lot of people are talking about in relation to this game is what is not here. You see, this is not technically the first updated version of this game out there. In fact, there was a pretty popular one called War of the Lions that had released previously. War of the Lions had some content that was not in the original that is also not in this version. This includes things like a couple of recruitable characters, some events and things you could see play out in game that are no longer there, on top of, I believe there was like a multiplayer or something involved there. And lastly, a couple of jobs being the sort of biggest omissions. Now, personally, I never played the War of the Lions version. I have played the original way back when, not in full, mind you, but a bit. But as a result, I can't really speak about what is or isn't here in terms of War of the Lions. But personally, it's not really a deal breaker for me, but obviously worth a mention. Now, from there, let's keep it moving, and next up, talk about the technical state of this game. How is this game running? And honestly, pretty flawlessly. I didn't have any issues at all. As you would probably hope for a different version of a 30-year-old game, at least on my end, there didn't seem to be any major issues, and again, it was pretty flawless for me. But otherwise, being able to simply play this on PC pretty seamlessly, was nice, but not much else to say here, so let's go ahead and move on to difficulty. So the enhanced version of the game does come with some new difficulty options, in particular easy, normal, or hard. Normal is basically what you would have played previously, otherwise known as Knight difficulty, and then you can also play as Squire for easy or Tactician for a more difficult experience. Now, it doesn't actually tell you what these change, and best I could tell from looking into it, it mostly seems to affect enemy damage more than anything else. It is very possible it affects other things, but again, it's not something I could really tell, and with the game's habit of actually hiding things like boss health, and the way enemy health normally just caps at a certain amount anyway, 999 at most. Enemy damage seems to be the big thing, of course, making the enemies you do face that much deadlier, and you having to know the best way to deal with them on the higher difficulty. However, with that in mind, you can change the difficulty freely. There's absolutely nothing locking you into a difficulty. And given the fact that it's very possible to outscale the main story, it's not going to wind up being a huge deal unless you're trying to play like max difficulty on a low level, that kind of thing, as people do like to enjoy certain types of challenge runs with these games, so that's certainly something to know, I suppose. But also in the difficulty section, I did want to cover a little bit about that scaling that I just mentioned. So an important thing to understand about this game is that you just grind things out. It's very possible to, like right in the first chapter, grind your characters to level 99 because of the way experience works. Basically, as you perform successful actions in combat, you gain experience right then and there, including your level ups. This means it's possible to keep a low-level enemy alive that is of no real threat, and then just spam successful support actions that give you experience and job points, which will level you up as you progress, and you can level up very, very quickly. Now, it's also important to note, though, that level isn't the only important thing here. In fact, much of the gameplay is really more about both equipable items and the actual job and job points, which are a separate progression. Nonetheless, it is very possible to out-level the main story and make it very easy. The catch to this is, what you cannot out-level, because it scales with you, are most of the random battles and even some of the monsters in the main battles. Not all of them, but some of them will scale with you. The catch here is that this makes, on occasion, some just random battles much harder than the actual main story progression. Luckily for us, however, one of the quality of life things they've done is allow you the option to flee random battles, so you just straight up don't have to fight those if you don't want to. So that's certainly something to know. Now, from there, let's go ahead and talk about the story setup. Now, probably the first thing you'll encounter when you go to start the story is that you enter your birthday. This is somewhat important in the sense that it sets your main character Ramza's zodiac sign. I'm going to explain more of this later, but for right now, just know that it is relatively important. This does have an effect, but it's not wildly necessary to concern yourself about it. So otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. You see, Final Fantasy Tactics tells actually a really great story about a pretty nuanced conflict across the setting of Ivalice. Ivalice happens to, in fact, be my personal favorite Final Fantasy setting. They've put a couple games here, notably Final Fantasy XII and Tactics being the main ones, I would say. But here we are playing during what they consider the Middle Ages, and in fact this story is being told to us through a bit of a narrative framing of someone finding an old set of research, basically just like a complete chronicle of all the events that have happened, and they're studying it and poring over it to learn what really happened to an unsung hero of the time, one Ramza Beolv. Some important context though. You see, during this particular point in time that we're discussing, Ivalice had just exited what they called the 50-Year War. A war that did a lot of damage to this particular nation, and unfortunately it's led to even more strife internally, as problems with, of course, economic productivity and just lack of control over the people around them has led to a great deal of instability that has led to just some revolts of peasants and normal folk against their highborn masters, leading to a war of nobles and the peasantry for the most part, and then things go from bad to worse when the king unexpectedly passes, leaving behind a child heir, and this causes a rush of the two dukes in the land, known as the White and Black Lion respectively, to fight over who gets to claim the throne via regency while the actual ruler grows up, basically. So, on top of all the other problems, now these two dukes are at war with each other, and then, as you would probably expect, there's even more to it than that. I don't want to say too much more, because obviously I want people to experience this for themselves, but there is a pretty interesting narrative here that dives into a lot of just fantastic subjects in a way that is really intriguing and worth experiencing all on its own. But Ramza is not alone. His childhood friend Delita is along for the ride here. But the thing is, Delita is actually just a common person who grew up as a companion to Ramza, a noble, which leads to its own tensions and back and forths when the casualties start popping up. So all of that to say, honestly, one of the best things about Final Fantasy Tactics is its story, and I'm glad people are going to be able to experience it for themselves. It has a lot of cool moments, and while I'm not personally wild about voice acting in general, the fact that it is voice acted for people I'm sure will be a plus, with probably the only other thing I want to mention being that there are a lot of names and nations and a lot of back and forth about what is happening all at once, and it can be a lot to remember, and thus the in-game chronicle does a really good job of sort of like cataloging all of that for you if you need to get caught up or you want to read about a particular character and try to understand what is happening. From there, though, let's talk about progression. So there are lots of progression systems in this game, but luckily they're all relatively simple once you understand how they work. You've basically got levels, your job, gear, and a couple of other random bits and bobs. So level's pretty straightforward. Perform actions in combat, you learn experience for doing so, and this levels up your base character. Now the catch here is, while this is important in the sense that you'll get stat increases, what stat increases you get are determined by the job you were in when you leveled up. Which brings us to the game's jobs. There are a lot of them. Some of them, I would argue, are like different tiers of the other ones, but basically each job allows you to perform the main thing that job is known for. Starting off, this is basically Squire or Chemist, with the Chemist being able to use items. Now, as you accrue job points by performing actions in combat while you are in the role of one of these jobs, you can then spend those job points on the various skills for that particular job, letting you, of course, use them in combat and be able to do more with them. Also, leveling up different jobs will unlock access to the later tiers of job, which will unlock even more and more of these for you. Now, these skills, outside of the job-specific stuff, like for instance, as I mentioned, the Chemist lets them use items, but they also get a bunch of different like support skills, reactions, that kind of thing that can be equipped to a character. So when you actually go to equip a character with these things, you're going to have the abilities of the job you are currently in, a second ability from a unique job that you have unlocked that you can then use freely from having unlocked it, and then an individual reaction, support, and movement ability from anything you've unlocked that you can just equip freely. And this is how you're going to sort of set up and build your character, including letting you mix and match things from other jobs you are not currently using. Now, an important thing to understand here, though, is innate versus skill abilities. Some jobs, in addition to everything I've just mentioned, also allow you the ability to do something innately that otherwise you would have to equip a skill for. A simple example is that ninjas can attack twice because they can dual wield. If you want to do that when you are not a ninja, you need to actually equip a skill that you can learn from the ninja job in order to do it. Another one is the orator. The orator can recruit enemies by using a low chance speechcraft skill basically to convince them to join you. The orator can actually do that to animals or monsters and stuff just by default. They don't have to equip a skill. However, even if you are using the speechcraft ability in another job, in order to do it to beasts, you have to have that skill equipped. So it's certainly important to understand stuff like that. Because of the way stats and everything work, though, it's not really necessary to learn everything on a single character, though there is an achievement for doing so. The more of these you learn and master will ultimately give you more options in combat, but do keep in mind probably the best thing you can do is decide roughly what you want that character to do and then keep them in those jobs until they get to a pretty decent level that you are comfortable spreading them out in terms of their stats gained from different levels. Now, if you're not really trying like super hard to min-max, it's honestly not that important. You'd probably be okay on a regular playthrough. But it's definitely something you want to know if you want to shoot for Tactician. Then we have gear, of course. This is heavily affected by the job you are currently in and any skills equipped because the gear you can equip is based on the job you are currently in. This determines the gear that is available to you and what you can use, of course. Now that's important because of obviously different items have different stats and effects, things like that. And oftentimes, jobs will give you the ability to equip something unique to them on every other job if you learn the skill from it but that will of course take up that slot for your equipped skill. So a lot going on there, and we'll talk a little bit more about the jobs themselves during the combat section, but for now let's go ahead and move on a little bit. Now, as a bit of a side progression, we have recruits. So we can recruit extra people to our party in one of two different ways. Either going to a settlement and recruiting them from the Warriors Guild as just a sort of flesh, blank-faced mercenary that you can then rename and customize to your heart's content. And then there are also set characters. There are set recruitable characters throughout the story, and in fact, some of them are pretty important. One of the first ones you're going to get, or potentially get, is a guy named Mustadio, who inadvertently turns out to be one of the more important characters because you see, the people you recruit can permanently die. You do not want that to happen to Mustadio because he is inadvertently sort of the gatekeeper to all of the other secret recruitable characters, because if he is not alive, then a scene cannot trigger that is required for all of this stuff to take place. So if you want the secret characters, make sure to keep that guy recruited and alive. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention for progression are that there is two things that are things you can only learn by getting hit by them in combat while you are in the appropriate job. This is the Ultima ability that is only applicable to Ramza and then the Zodiarch summon. There are a few creatures towards the end of the game that cast an ability called Ultima. The only person that can learn that on your end is Ramza. Ramza, in his main job, can learn that if he gets hit by it. The other one being the secret summon. Anybody with the summoner job can learn this, but it's from what is essentially the game's super boss at the end of its optional dungeon, and it is highly missable, so when you get to a place called Midlight's Deep, you better go into that prepared if you don't want to miss it. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward in terms of how you learn and apply all of this stuff. So from there, let's go ahead and talk about the gameplay and world of this game. So the gameplay and the world of Final Fantasy Tactics here is mostly going to take place on the world map, which you are going to be able to traverse from point to point, which is going to bring you to the locations of basically settlements or battlefields. Battlefields are where potentially random battles can take place, of course, but you also simply just navigate them from town to town. Now, settlements are where we have a little bit more to talk about in terms of the way exploration and stuff works, because this is home to a bunch of different services like the Outfitters, the Tavern, the Warriors Guild. Some of them have poachers' dens, and you can do a few other things as well. But the Outfitters is basically the shop where you can buy and sell. Each individual settlement has different things for sale, and you can catalog all this information via the location list, which you can bring up, and it'll give you a rough idea of the type of equipment each place sells as you go over it. The Tavern is where you're going to pick up errands, rumors, and occasionally side quests that are associated with those. More on those in a second. We also have the Poacher's Den. Starting a little later into the game, you can, if you have the ability Poach equipped, start poaching monsters. This gives you the option to then take those carcasses back to the Poacher's Den in certain settlements where they can then process those carcasses into useful items for you. There's an achievement to get a bunch of items that are only available in this manner, and that actually kind of wound up being the most annoying one because all of them are mostly from monsters found in the optional dungeon that we'll talk about, which was a little bit of a hassle, but nonetheless, that's how you can earn some of the really rare stuff in addition to like stealing it off of enemies. Taverns, however, have the option of giving us rumors and errands. So errands are effectively little side quests that characters you're not necessarily using right now can go perform for you. You can send up to 3 people for a set number of days on these missions, and then they can either succeed or fail at them. If they fail, you will have the option to redo it later, but basically if you actually send 3 people and you give them the maximum amount of days possible, it will be extremely rare that you fail this, and then they will bring back things like rewards and stuff that you can enjoy in the form of like gold and occasionally items and the like. And there's also like a little collectible thing that goes alongside this that doesn't seem to affect anything but is, fun, I guess. And then next up we have our side quests. So pretty much all of these, as mentioned, involved having Mustadio around so he can trigger them, as all the side quests or side stories basically involve going around and recruiting all of the game's secret characters. This includes things like Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, but also Beowulf and his lover turned dragon Rice, I'm not sure. The enhanced version actually does a pretty good job of like marking this stuff on the world map, so it's a little easier to follow here than it was in the original, but you still have to actually go through all of the steps, mind you, once you've triggered the initial scene, which is not marked. But basically you just take Mustadio in your party back to where he's from in chapter 4, the final chapter, and it kicks it all off for you. The other thing you need to be doing is buying a flower for a single gil at a certain plot moment from a flower peddler, which may sound familiar but is also required in order to recruit Cloud. So there's that. Now, you may have noticed in some of this footage that days are actually passing. A single day passes from every point on the world map that you travel. Now, don't freak out too much. There is not actually a timer in-game or anything. Nothing is going to expire based on these, but there is some stuff tied to important dates that kind of coincide with your zodiac signs, as you could probably tell from the days of the calendar, but also some of the errands are only available seasonally during certain months, that kind of thing. Now, something you may want to use some of these very overpowered secret characters on is in fact the game's optional dungeon, Midlight's Deep, available only right before the very end of the game. This side dungeon allows you to traverse a pitch-dark series of levels where you have to not only defeat the enemies on those levels, but also find the exit at the same time until you get to the very end where you can fight what this game has for a super boss, more or less. This guy is the only person who can teach your summoners the final summon, and it's a very difficult fight. But the good news is, after you've beaten this guy, you can come back here and take on these individual levels in order to fight the best monsters for potentially the best loot. So it's definitely worth your time if you want to go through with it. Now, before we dive fully into combat, I want to first talk about some of those secret characters. So let's talk about Cloud a little bit. He's famously the most difficult to actually acquire and has some unique stuff going on, as he gets access to his limit breaks in combat, but this requires the use of his materia blade, as it's called. I believe you had to go find this in the original, but he just has it with him when you recruit him this time around, and what's more, he actually scales to your level here now, so you don't have to spend time leveling him back up, which is true for most of the others, though not all of them. And while Beowulf and his companion Rice can also be very good thanks to their skills and abilities, what really makes every single one of these secret characters really unique is the ability to use their unique jobs. So every single recruitable character, be that main story or secret character, is different from your party, and the reason you want to keep them around primarily is that they have a unique job that only they can use, which obviously makes them of value in certain situations, and that's really kind of the best thing about them. It's not required or necessary that you do that, but some of them can be extremely powerful, like Orlando, who, while notoriously overpowered in the original, has been reined in a little, but is still extremely strong here. From there, let's finally go ahead and talk about combat. So combat, as you'd probably expect from a tactics game, is kind of the bread and butter of the experience here outside of the story. But before we even start, there's a few things to note. Battles can take place on battlefields, which are the random encounters you can either choose to engage in or flee from in the various parts of the world. There are the multiple level dungeons where you have to fight a bunch of fights back to back in order to advance the story typically. Even Midlight's Deep does not operate that way. And then lastly, just various story locations at settlements and stuff where you have specific fights. So that's kind of what you're looking at in terms of how these fights are structured, but thanks to some of the enhanced versions changes and things, you can return to the world map or retry battles or even restart a battle while changing out your formation, adjusting jobs, that kind of thing, and the only thing you lose when doing this is what you just gained in the fight you had, so levels, experience, that kind of thing, and as a result, it's very easy to just back out of a fight that you can't win or are having too much trouble with and carry on your way with basically no real loss outside of maybe some time spent realizing you couldn't do it. So it's very forgiving in that respect, but before we move on to some of the more intricate things, we need to first talk about zodiac signs and the bravery and faith mechanic. So straight away, zodiac signs is not something the casual player really needs to concern themselves with. It's interesting to know, but it is just not necessary for a normal playthrough. Basically, the zodiac signs assigned to Ramza that you chose by picking his birthday, and then of course the zodiac signs assigned to everybody else by default, do technically have an effect on the game, namely for things like spells, because each individual zodiac sign is compatible or incompatible with other signs, which then adds a modifier for both damage or damage reduction respectively based on what you are doing. For the most part, what this affects is things like spells, as well as your innate chance to succeed on percentage-based stuff, meaning that as a result, there's really only a few situations where this is straight up necessary, I think, to make your life easier. If you purposefully set up a party of characters who have compatible zodiac signs, you'll find it a little easier to do things like buff and heal, because the magic for doing that stuff will connect more often because of the percent chance to succeed. This also applies to things like stealing from enemies though, because that is a percent chance to succeed, meaning that if you have the signs set up correctly, you could theoretically steal really great equipment like the Genji equipment from Marquis Elmdor much more easily than you could otherwise. So it's not fair to say that the zodiac signs aren't worth understanding at all, because I don't think that's true, but they don't have as big of an impact as you might suspect, and as a result, unless you're like min-maxing on the top difficulty, I really wouldn't worry about it, especially since making the most of it requires you to know exactly what you're facing, which is obviously going to be a bit spoilery for a first time through, but if you want to play a second time and make use of it, it's something to know. The other side of that though is bravery and faith. Every character has a bravery and faith mechanic, which are much more directly important to combat. So you have a base value and then the adjusted value thanks to things like skills and stuff that will happen during the course of combat. Not necessarily, but there are basically skills and stuff that can affect this. This is important because bravery and faith have a variety of different effects, namely in the form of more damage with the associated thing the higher it is. Now, it is technically possible to have bravery so low that a character leaves you, but I mean, you'd almost have to be intentionally trying to do that. It is so unlikely for that to happen naturally. But as you'd probably expect, these affect melee and magic accordingly, but not in totality either. So most notable is faith. Increased faith increases not only your magic damage done, but also your magic damage received. So a high faith character will be able to deal out some serious damage with this, but is also going to take a lot more magical damage as a result, which makes the use of things like shell and stuff to reduce that incoming damage very important. Bravery actually affects a lot less than you would probably think. You might just think, oh, it affects melee attacks, but it actually only affects some melee attacks, from things like, I believe it's katanas as well as the knight swords, which are unique to those jobs. And I think technically it increases bare-handed hits too. But another really big thing bravery actually does is the chance of your reaction abilities triggering. This is things like parrying, if you have the skills for it, that kind of stuff. So parrying, countering, things like that. That is more likely to happen the higher your bravery stat is. So it's important to keep an eye on these metrics for every single character, but you don't necessarily need to min-max them to get the most out of it either. Just be aware of how they work mostly. Otherwise, let's talk about the rest of combat, of course. So combat in this game is relatively simple in the sense that every character's turn basically comes down to a move and an action based on the initiative order for that particular bit of combat. When it is your turn, you can choose to move, obviously, within the range of that character's movement limits. You also have to take into account things like elevation and terrain, as each character has things like a jump or movement stat, which is going to affect how well they can traverse certain types of terrain, and there are skills that can get around this, like fly or teleport, but you also have the ability to, of course, take that action. This can be a basic attack with the weapon for the job you are using, or whatever particular job abilities you have equipped at the time, be that your current job, obviously, or an ability from any other job you've got set up. Most battles will see you either with 4 or 5 people, given the guest situation for an individual battle based on the story, things like that. With basically everything else about combat being incredibly job specific, so this is where I'm going to talk about those and what each individual job can do, and of course what you have to prepare for coming in terms of status effects, which the enemies will try to put on you a lot in the late game as a sort of method of the tactics and control at play. So basically it's elevation, jobs, status effects, things like that you have to watch out for here. But one big thing I really want to mention that I don't like at all are that knights and thieves are able to either destroy or steal equipment permanently. Now you can do this to enemies, but obviously it's going to affect that battle, whereas if enemies do it to you, that equipment is just straight up gone. Forever. You have to replace it. That can be extremely bad if you are using an incredibly rare item as an example. So that's something you need to be aware of, and you need to deal with those characters pretty quick. I am not a fan of the permanent item loss, especially given how difficult some items are to acquire via things like the poaching system. I don't like that at all. Now, a lot of the intricacy and nuance of this entire system really is how all of these jobs interact with each other, and how you, of course, can customize them and set them to do certain things for you and mix and match them in interesting ways. But with the limitation of roughly 2 jobs at a time, more or less, it is more approachable than a games like Tactics Ogre, as an example, which I think is significantly bigger in terms of both the number of people on screen, but also like possible combinations and stuff. So in that way, I think Final Fantasy Tactics is the more approachable game. But that doesn't mean there isn't other fun stuff to do as well outside of those jobs, which I am going to get to, I promise. Starting with those status effects. So this is definitely a thing more in the late game, but a lot of enemies will obviously put certain status effects on you that can be very debilitating, like turning you into a toad, putting you to sleep, stopping you, basically anything that's going to take your turns away. There are ways to mitigate this. Usually stuff like that has a chance to hit, and they might just straight up miss anyway, but there's also a variety of different accessories characters can put on, which will just straight up make you immune to this stuff, which is extremely helpful for certain fights if you are struggling. Like if you're struggling with an enemy that's turning you into a vampire, which is a loss of control effect, or is just straight up turning your characters to stone, that kind of thing. Obviously accessories that make you just straight up immune to the main thing they're doing is going to turn the tide in your favor. But the other side of it is recruiting beasts and creatures. So various moments in the story will present themselves to you to recruit a few different creatures, but you can also do it via jobs, helping you do things like tame, or using the orator as an example in order to just sort of convince enemies to join you instead via their entice ability. So there are ways to convert the enemy to your side. In terms of creatures, however, this is especially notable for things like chocobos, so these guys do count if you bring them into a battle against your character limit, so that's something to be aware of. But while they do have abilities and things that they can use on their own, they also bring some interesting dynamics to a battlefield, like it's possible to mount chocobos in combat, which gives you a hugely increased movement, as they obviously have a big movement stat. And then there are other creatures that you can bring in as well, even a couple of which that are only available via breeding, which is to say just having them in your party will eventually lead to eggs showing up in your party that will then hatch into potentially different variations of that same creature. And in the case of a couple of them, this is actually the only way you'll encounter some of them, which you can then poach for specific items that only they drop, which is how you can get stuff like the ribbon, which blocks all status effects. Another really big thing you have to pay attention to is when you are casting an ability, it's going to come with a slight delay based on the power of what you are casting. An increased speed stat will hurry this up and make you do that stuff faster, but it's also really important then to understand that not only when you are casting something, but what is the battlefield going to look like when that spell actually goes off. This is why it's important to either target a unit or a tile. It's possible to target a space or an individual unit. If you target the unit, as long as they are in range whenever the spell goes off, it will still hit them, whereas if they are on a tile, if nobody's on that tile when the spell finishes, then nothing happens. This also occasionally applies to a couple other things that are actually not spells at all, such as the Dragoon Job's Jump ability, which fully upgraded allows them a massive amount of movement and the ability to attack enemies that are way far away from you. However, when they go up in the air versus when they come down to hit the enemy is a matter of their speed stat, and you have to hopefully make sure that that enemy is in the same place when you jump as when you come down. Now, one really fun way, and probably one of the strongest ways to get around this casting delay, is the arithmetician job, which I believe is sometimes referred to as the calculator. This is like the final end goal of all the various casters, really, is to be this job combined with whatever else they want to do, and that is because this character basically sets a condition, a trigger, and then picks from a giant list of spells they know to happen instantly, potentially to an entire battlefield of enemies. The catch being that this can sometimes also hit you if you don't set it up properly, because basically you can target an enemy's experience, level, elevation even by a factor of 4, 5, or prime. So if something like, say, their level is a factor of 5 or 4, as an example, you could then hit them guaranteed with a high-powered spell at 0 cast time instantaneously. And when you can set that up to hit entire fields of enemies thanks to a common number, there is basically nothing that will deal more damage than a well-placed arithmetician attack. It's insane. The drawback being, of course, that you just got to make sure you don't hit yourself at the same time, but it is ridiculous strong. It's super fun, actually. Now, in terms of other jobs, things you're going to want to be aware of are that in order to use items, you're going to need to be a alchemist at some point and learn how to use those items, and then also have that job ability equipped so you can't just use items freeform. It's also possible to use summons and espers and things in battle, including the secret one Zodiarch, which is crazy strong, but in order to do that, you have to have the Summoner class available to you. It's possible to steal equipment, including very, very good equipment, from enemies permanently via, of course, things like the Thief job, which gets the steal action. If you want to recruit enemies or turn creatures to your side, you're going to want the Orator, who can, of course, entice or tame. The Dragoon, as I mentioned, gets their incredibly mobile jump ability, which can be really strong. The Samurai gets a variety of different abilities that allow them to make use of the spirit inside various katanas. Being a ninja allows you to both attack twice via their dual wield feature, but also gets the ability to throw items at distant enemies as well, which can be really great in certain situations. Other particular jobs are a little more difficult to use, but if you can find a use case for them, can be really fun, like Geomancy. Geomancy has a different effect based on the type of terrain you are currently standing on, which can be difficult to make work, but in certain situations, like when you are able to use a magma ability, just comes with a chance of instant death to the enemy. There are the various types of mages, which in addition to their unique forms of magic, can also give you the ability to do things like teleport. There are a couple of gender-specific jobs via the dancer or the bard. Via their dance or bard song ability respectively, you can either buff characters every turn or debuff enemies every turn, or hit them with status ailments to be specific, which can be incredibly debilitating over the course of a few turns even. The Bard even has an ability that will give your characters an extra turn every turn, but it takes like a really long time to actually get that one to work. So basically, there's a ton of different ways to approach combat. Sometimes it's down to specific characters that get unique things. Sometimes it's using jobs in a multitude of different ways that can produce effects you might not expect. Sometimes it's just a simple matter of understanding the enemy you're looking at, their inherent weaknesses versus what you've got on deck. And I think that's where the highlight of a game like Final Fantasy Tactics really lies, in the fact that it's approachable, yet has a ton of variety and different ways to approach the combat that makes it a lot of fun. And I think things like the added difficulty and quality of life changes are really going to make an impact for people here, which is going to make for a really fun experience for the people who are playing this game for the first time, I would imagine. But all of that said, let's finally move on a little bit, starting with the Steam Deck section. Probably entirely unsurprisingly, this game runs very well on the Steam Deck. It does technically have a playable rating if you're looking for the official Steam rating, and that is because some of the text and stuff on the various menus is small and hard to read, and that is fair. There's a lot of text-heavy menus, things like that. But in terms of like quality and how it plays, not only does this genre play really well on the Steam Deck, it's also obviously not exactly a graphically intensive game, so a pretty straightforward experience overall. You should have no trouble playing this as long as you are able to, of course, see what you are looking at. Which brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, obviously the story, I think the story of Ramza and the middle age of Ivalice is especially compelling stuff. There's a lot of great writing there, a lot of angst, a lot of harsh realities of the world at play even, and it's a really great time. I love the battle system. I enjoy mixing and matching this stuff to find different ways to handle situations in ways that feel unique. I also love all the quality of life features they added here. It makes this particular version of this game very, very approachable, which is obviously going to give people today a better chance of experiencing this and walking away from it having had a really great time, which I think is important because, as people watching this are probably aware to some degree, Final Fantasy Tactics is an incredibly important game in the TRPG genre. It's kind of one of the greats, and while it has certainly moved on since then, I do think this game is worth experiencing to this day for that reason, and all of these changes help facilitate that. But nonetheless, we do have some negatives. For starters, the item loss stuff. Don't care for that at all. I could see why they obviously wouldn't remove that for the sake of a game like this and the nature of what this release is, but replacing equipment that is constantly getting destroyed by just a random little minion's lucky hit, or some thieves with some high initiative orders getting lucky steals, that kind of thing. Just having to replace equipment gets really annoying really fast. And it's not the end of the world or anything, but when you lose especially rare equipment that you've acquired through things like grinding poaching because of just some random little bit of chance, it's the kind of thing you'd honestly rather just reload than deal with, at least for me. And I just don't love that as a mechanic, and I'm kind of glad it's mostly been left behind. Another thing I don't really love is the zodiac signs and the calendar system. I think the zodiac signs are are obscure, honestly. I think making the most out of them requires so much meta knowledge about the game that they add virtually nothing to the main experience. And even when you have the knowledge to make use of them, I don't think that the experience using them is so like fundamentally different that it bears, worth, really. It's just not, I think, time well spent trying to min-max zodiac signs and compatibility and stuff. And I don't think it's a particularly well thought out system. In fact, I think this is one of the areas where Tactics Ogre, a game in a similar genre with honestly just more depth in most cases, does a better job with its elemental affinities. And yeah, all things being honest, I think the lack of the War of the Lions content is a bit of a bummer. In particular, I really love Balthier, who is a recruitable character in the War of the Lions version that I really would have loved to have hung out with, frankly. But I can also see the decision of trying to stick to what was just in the original game versus that release. But I still think it's definitely a bit of a bummer, and so it's in the negative section. But nonetheless, that brings us to our conclusion. By and large, Final Fantasy Tactics is a great game that is worth experiencing, and I think this remaster goes a long way towards making that a more approachable subject for most people. Thanks to all the quality of life features, the upgrades, things like that, I think this version of the game is probably going to be the easiest place for someone to take a look at this game and experience it for what it is. At the very same time, this game is $50 US for the base, and then there's a deluxe edition that is $60 US. And that's a pretty significant price for a game that originally released in 1997. While I am not in love with that price, to be sure, I am still going to give this a buy simply because I think they have done enough to warrant it via things like the full voice acting, which is obviously expensive, just bringing this to PC in a way that is easy and accessible for most people. All of the other changes that I've went through and listed over the course of this review, I can live with this at $50, even if I would have preferred it was a little bit cheaper. With that in mind, once you find this game at a price point you are comfortable with, I would imagine it will be on sale in the future on occasion, given that we've already seen things like Tactics Ogre Reborn, as an example, be on sale for as low as like $20. I think that's actually the case right now. And that game is also normally $50 US. So whether you buy it now or later, I do think it's worth experiencing, and hopefully you'll get the chance to do just that. And to that end, I hope that you found this video helpful or informative in that regard. But that is nonetheless where we're going to wrap it up. So if you enjoyed all of that, or you just want to tell me how you feel about the game, I suppose, certainly like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.